What happens when a young black woman is wrongly accused of something she did not do? What will one woman's unconscious racism lead her to face? This is a story of injustice, community wake-up calls, and the power of standing up for what is right. Will Jada's voice be heard? See how one incident changes everything. Follow H2 Black Thread to see this powerful journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon in Westfield, the kind of day when the sun shone just right and the world seemed to move at a slower pace. The town itself seemed to breathe a sense of calm. Houses with white picket fences lined the streets, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other by face, if not by name. And most of the time, that wasn't a bad thing. People were friendly enough, waving at each other over the tops of hedges, exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed. But as 11-year-old Jada Williams would soon discover, even in a place that seemed so perfect, not everything was as it appeared. Jada stood outside Creamy Cones, the town's beloved ice cream shop, a place she visited nearly every weekend. She loved the atmosphere, warm, inviting, and always full of life. The pastel-colored storefront, the bright neon sign, the mix of happy chatter from kids and parents, it all felt like a second home. The small town had its quirks, but to Jada, it was a place where she could feel free, at least for a little while. The ice cream was always her favorite treat, especially the classic swirl of chocolate and vanilla she'd get with her best friend Maya. Today was no different, or so it seemed at first. Jada stood with her back resting against the bright pink wall of the shop, her neon yellow sneakers tapping lightly against the sidewalk. The sun beat down on her, and she checked her phone for any messages. Her mother, Detective Veronica Williams, was away at a conference in Washington, D.C. And although Jada missed her mom terribly, she'd always managed to keep herself busy with reading, her favorite escape. Jada had always been a bookworm, particularly drawn to mysteries. She loved reading Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, and she often imagined herself as a detective just like her mom. Veronica worked for the FBI, solving cases and uncovering the truth, and Jada admired her mother's strength and dedication to justice. One day, Jada hoped to follow in her footsteps, to solve cases and fight for what was right. But today, while Jada stood waiting for Maya, things were about to take a turn she wasn't expecting. She hadn't noticed it at first, but there was something different in the air. The usual buzz of excitement in the shop and the soft chatter of passing neighbors faded into the background as she realized she was being watched. Karen Thompson, a woman in her 40s with perfectly curled blonde hair and sharp features, stepped out of Manny's Brew, the nearby coffee shop where she was a regular. Jada had seen her around town, but she didn't know her well. Karen always seemed to be the type who liked to project a picture-perfect life, well put together and always smiling, though there was something about her that made Jada uneasy. It wasn't that Karen had ever been rude, but there was a certain look in her eyes sometimes, like she was assessing people, making judgments before even saying a word. At first, Jada didn't think much of it when Karen's eyes landed on her, but it didn't take long for her to realize that something was off. There was a coldness in Karen's gaze, a disapproving quality that made Jada uncomfortable. She quickly looked away, hoping to avoid confrontation. But then, she noticed Karen was walking toward her. Jada's heart rate picked up, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. As Karen drew closer, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, Jada couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building in her chest. She stood up a little straighter, trying to calm herself. Maybe Karen was just going to ask her something innocuous, nothing to worry about. But no. As Karen stopped a few feet in front of her, Jada's pulse quickened. "Excuse me, young lady," Karen said, her voice firm, almost accusing. "What are you doing here?" Jada blinked in surprise, caught off guard by the directness of the question. She wasn't used to being questioned like this. "I'm just waiting for my friend," Jada answered, trying to sound as polite as possible, keeping her voice steady. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked Jada up and down, her lips pressing into a thin line. She scanned Jada's bright yellow sneakers, then looked at her face, but there was no warmth in her gaze. "Waiting for your friend, huh?" Karen repeated, her voice dripping with suspicion. There was a slight sarcasm in her tone that made Jada's stomach churn. Jada hesitated. "Yes, just waiting for Maya. She's inside getting ice cream." She wasn't sure why, but she felt an urge to justify herself, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. But Karen wasn't finished. "I've been noticing you standing here for a while," Karen continued, taking a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "And I saw you earlier, looking inside the parked cars, checking to see if they're locked maybe." Jada's breath caught in her throat. What was she talking about? "I wasn't looking inside any cars," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just waiting for my friend." Karen's face remained hard and unyielding. "I think you were casing the cars," she said, her voice low but full of accusation. "You know, checking to see if there's anything valuable inside." Jada's mouth went dry. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. She felt a pit growing in her stomach as the weight of Karen's accusation sank in. How could this woman think that about her? She was just a kid, waiting for her friend. This wasn't fair. Before Jada could say anything more, Karen whipped out her phone and quickly dialed a number. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual," Karen said, her voice getting louder, more confident. "There's a young black girl about 12 years old standing outside the ice cream shop. She's been acting suspiciously around parked cars like she's trying to steal something." Jada froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't done anything wrong, and now Karen was making a call that could ruin everything. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it felt like a nightmare. Jada's hands shook as she pulled out her own phone, desperately dialing her mom's number. Maybe Veronica would pick up. Maybe she could help. But the phone rang and then went to voicemail. Karen, still talking to the dispatcher, paced back and forth. Jada's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she fought them back. She didn't want to cry, not in front of this woman, not when she had done nothing wrong. The sirens wailed in the distance, and Jada's stomach twisted in fear. She was about to face the police over a crime she didn't commit. Her only hope now was that, somehow, this would all blow over. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change, forever. The sound of sirens grew louder as the police cruiser turned onto the street, its flashing lights painting the quiet afternoon with an unsettling urgency. Jada's stomach twisted in knots as she watched the car pull up, the blue and red lights reflecting off the storefront windows, making everything feel surreal. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be here, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Karen Thompson, her face glowing with self-satisfaction, turned to look at Jada as the police car skidded to a stop in front of the creamy cones. She gave a tight nod, as if confirming that everything was going according to plan. As the police officer stepped out of the car, Jada's heart skipped a beat. The officer was tall, with a well-kept uniform and a serious demeanor. His name tag read Officer Roberts. Jada had seen him around town before. He was the kind of officer who seemed to know everyone by name, the type of cop you could count on in the community. But seeing him now, approaching her with purposeful strides, made everything feel like it was slipping out of her control. Officer Roberts' eyes quickly took in the scene, Karen standing by, arms crossed, a look of righteous fury on her face, and Jada standing there, small and vulnerable, her bright yellow sneakers the only splash of color in the sea of monotony around her. The officer didn't speak immediately, his gaze shifting between Karen and Jada as if weighing the situation. "So, what's going on here?" Officer Roberts' voice was calm but firm. He wasn't accusing anyone yet, but the way he looked at them both, as though trying to piece together an incomplete puzzle, made Jada feel even smaller. Karen was quick to speak up. "I called you because I saw this girl acting suspiciously around the parked cars," she said, her voice dripping with accusation. "She was just standing there, looking inside the vehicles as if she was trying to steal something. I've had enough of this kind of behavior in my neighborhood." Jada felt her face flush with humiliation. "I wasn't looking in anyone's cars," she protested, her voice shaky but firm. "I was just waiting for my friend Maya. She's inside buying ice cream." Officer Roberts turned his attention to Jada, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't seem entirely convinced by Karen's story, but he wasn't jumping to conclusions either. His eyes studied Jada, noticing how her shoulders were slumped with embarrassment and how her eyes shifted nervously toward the ground. She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like a kid caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. "You're just waiting for your friend?" Officer Roberts asked, his tone softer now, trying to get to the bottom of things. Jada nodded quickly, trying to hide the tremble in her voice. "Yes. I was just standing here. I didn't touch anything." Karen, however, wasn't about to let go of her accusation so easily. "She was looking in the cars. I saw her. You can't just let someone like her get away with this," she said, her voice rising slightly, now full of urgency. "We have enough problems with theft around here. I won't sit by and watch her get away with it." The officer held up a hand, signaling for Karen to quiet down. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I need to hear from the girl," he said, his eyes still on Jada. "Is there anyone we can call to confirm your story?" Jada swallowed hard. She hadn't expected this. She thought this would all be over by now, but now that the police were involved, she felt the weight of the situation settle over her like a thick fog. Jada reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. She was about to dial her mom, Detective Veronica Williams, when the thought struck her. Her mom was at a conference. There was no way she'd be able to pick up. Jada hesitated for a moment, then tried anyway. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before it went to voicemail. Her heart sank. "I'm sorry, your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system." The voicemail message began. Jada quickly ended the call, feeling the overwhelming sense of helplessness sink deeper into her chest. She couldn't reach her mom. She needed someone, anyone, to help her get out of this nightmare. Panicked, Jada's fingers shook as she dialed the next number she could think of, her Aunt Gloria. Gloria was close to her mom and had always been a steady figure in Jada's life, someone she could count on when things got tough. The phone rang, and for a moment, Jada allowed herself to hope that someone, anyone, would pick up. After what seemed like an eternity, Gloria's voice came through the receiver. "Jada, what's wrong, sweetie?" Gloria's voice was calm, but Jada could hear the concern in it. I need you, Aunt Gloria," Jada said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm at the ice cream shop and Karen called the cops on me. She's saying I was looking inside cars, but I didn't do anything." Gloria didn't hesitate. "Stay right there. I'm coming over," she said quickly. "Don't worry, honey, I'll be there in a few minutes." Jada hung up the phone, relief flooding her for just a second, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. Gloria would be there soon, but the waiting felt unbearable. Karen was still standing a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if she were daring Jada to argue. The police officer had been watching Jada the whole time. He still hadn't said much, but it was clear from the look in his eyes that he wasn't entirely sure what was going on here. There was something off about this situation, something he couldn't quite place. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to call Jada's guardian to confirm her story," Officer Roberts said, his tone steady but firm. He made a quick note on his notepad and then reached for his radio. "We'll give them a moment to respond, but I'm not jumping to any conclusions just yet." Jada could feel the tension in the air thickening. Karen's glare bore into her, but Jada refused to meet her eyes. She didn't know how long she would have to wait for Aunt Gloria to arrive, but right now, the world felt like it had shrunk down to just this moment. A moment where every second felt like it was dragging on, stretching her nerves thinner and thinner. She tried to distract herself by looking at the ice cream shop's window, where she could see Maya happily licking her cone. Maya had no idea what was going on outside, and for a moment, Jada almost wished she could go back to being that carefree kid, waiting for nothing more than a scoop of ice cream. But she couldn't. This was real. This was happening. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. Karen's stare never left Jada, and Jada couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The calm afternoon had turned into something darker, and she could only hope that, somehow, it would all work out. But right now, all she could do was wait for Aunt Gloria to arrive and pray that someone would understand the truth before it was too late. The tension in the air was palpable as the minutes ticked by. Jada stood there, her nerves stretched thin, watching the officer call for backup as Karen paced back and forth in a show of impatience. Jada's phone was still in her hand, and she found herself checking it repeatedly, even though there were no new messages. The sound of distant voices and the occasional car passing by seemed to grow louder, amplifying the silence between the two of them. Karen, as if oblivious to the growing discomfort, seemed almost eager for things to escalate. She had called the police, made her accusations, and now, it seemed, she was waiting for a show of support, one that could justify her actions in the eyes of everyone around her. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, watching Jada with a self-assured look, as if she were certain that she had been right all along. Officer Roberts, who had been calm throughout the entire ordeal, took a deep breath and turned to Jada. "We've reviewed the situation, and I've spoken with my supervisor. We don't have enough evidence to make an arrest, but we'd like to resolve this peacefully. So, we're offering a mediation session. This will allow both sides to sit down, share their versions of events, and hopefully come to an understanding without escalating things any further." Jada's heart skipped a beat. A mediation. This wasn't how she'd imagined her afternoon going. She had just wanted to enjoy a scoop of ice cream, not sit down and talk through a misunderstanding with the woman who had called the police on her for no reason. But with no other option, Jada nodded silently. At least this way, she wouldn't be dragged through any more confusion. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to perk up at the suggestion. She had been expecting this moment, hadn't she? She looked over at the officer, eyes narrowed, clearly not satisfied but too proud to back down now. "I'm happy to resolve this," Karen said, her voice dripping with a thinly veiled superiority. "I've seen enough of this kind of behavior in my neighborhood, and I'm just doing what's best for everyone. I can't let this kind of thing go unaddressed." Officer Roberts gave a curt nod, then looked back at Jada. "Are you okay with this, miss?" Jada hesitated for a moment, glancing over at her friend Maya, who had now joined the crowd of curious onlookers. Jada's heart clenched as she met her friend's worried gaze. Maya had seen the whole thing unfold, but she hadn't known how much deeper it was going to get. Jada took a deep breath, trying to hold it together. "Yeah," she said softly, but there was a sharpness to her voice now. She wasn't going to back down, not after everything that had happened. "I'll do it." With a simple nod, the officers escorted both Jada and Karen to the local police station, where a small conference room had been prepared for the mediation. The room was sterile and impersonal, with white walls and a circular wooden table in the middle. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, making the whole place feel even more uncomfortable. Jada could feel her stomach flip as she sat down across from Karen. This was real. This was happening. But before they could begin, the door to the room opened and Detective Veronica Williams, Jada's mother, entered. She stood tall and confident, her presence immediately filling the room with authority. Her sharp gaze fell on Karen first, then on Jada, who immediately stood up to greet her. "Mom!" Jada's voice cracked as she rushed to her mother's side, feeling a sense of relief wash over her at the sight of her. Detective Veronica placed a reassuring hand on Jada's shoulder, giving her a quick hug before turning her attention to Karen. "I'm Detective Veronica Williams," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience. "I've heard about the incident, and I'm here to make sure my daughter is treated fairly." Karen's face reddened slightly at the sight of Veronica, her gaze dropping for a brief moment before she regained her composure. I understand," Karen stammered, though it was clear she wasn't happy about the situation. "But this girl was acting suspiciously and I had to do something." Detective Veronica remained calm. She didn't let the frustration that she must have been feeling show on her face. "I understand that you felt concerned," she said, her tone unwavering. "But I want you to understand that my daughter did nothing wrong. She was simply waiting for her friend. No cars were touched, and there's no evidence that she did anything that would warrant the police being called." Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line, her eyes darting between Detective Veronica and Jada. "But I saw her," Karen insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "She was standing there looking inside cars. I couldn't just ignore that." "Karen, you need to realize something," Detective Veronica said, her voice sharp but controlled. "You are accusing my daughter of something based purely on your assumptions. There's no evidence to support your claims, and I'm sure you understand that making baseless accusations like that can lead to serious consequences." Karen shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under the steady gaze of Veronica. "I'm just trying to protect the neighborhood," she muttered, looking away. "I can't let things like this slide." Detective Veronica's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "I understand wanting to keep your neighborhood safe, but accusing an innocent child of something she didn't do isn't the way to go about it. You've hurt my daughter. You've made her feel like she's guilty of something, and that's not something that should be taken lightly." Jada's chest tightened as she listened to her mom. She could feel the heat in her face as the words sank in. She had never wanted any of this to happen. All she had wanted was a normal afternoon. But now, everything had shifted. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her, and hearing her mom stand up for her only made her feel more determined. She wasn't going to let this go. Karen, however, wasn't ready to admit fault. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," she said, her voice wavering slightly. I thought she might be up to something." Jada's jaw clenched, but Veronica stepped in before things could escalate. "The fact is, you were wrong, Karen," Veronica said, her voice calm yet unyielding. "And now, we're here to resolve this." The mediation continued with both sides explaining their perspectives, but Karen's stance didn't change. She insisted that she had been acting out of concern, even though there was no real proof of anything suspicious. Veronica, however, remained firm in defending Jada, making it clear that her daughter was the victim of a baseless accusation. At the end of the session, Veronica turned to Karen one last time. "I think we're done here. You've had your say, and now we've made it clear where the truth lies. I'm grateful that we could talk through this, but let's not pretend there isn't a lesson to be learned here." Karen didn't respond. She simply sat there, her face flushed with shame as she realized the full weight of her actions. The truth was clear now, and though Karen refused to admit it, everyone in the room knew that Jada had done nothing wrong. The mediation had ended, but the effects of that day lingered long after. Karen Thompson, once so resolute in her belief that she had done the right thing, now found herself in the uncomfortable position of reflecting on the consequences of her actions. For the first time, she was forced to confront the reality of her behavior. Her accusations had been unfounded, and in trying to protect the community, she had instead harmed one of its youngest and most vulnerable members. And worse, she had contributed to a cycle of fear and misunderstanding based solely on bias. As the days passed, Karen's thoughts continued to circle back to that afternoon. She tried to tell herself she had acted with good intentions, that she had seen something suspicious and responded accordingly. But deep down, she couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at her. She had wrongly assumed that Jada, a young black girl standing outside an ice cream shop, was up to no good. And that assumption, Karen realized, was rooted in something much deeper than just this one isolated incident. Karen's discomfort with the situation didn't dissipate. It was inescapable, and no amount of rationalizing could make it go away. Detective Veronica Williams had made it clear during the mediation that making baseless accusations could lead to serious consequences, both for Jada and the community at large. What had begun as a misguided attempt to keep the neighborhood safe had turned into a lesson that Karen wasn't prepared to ignore. The truth had come to light during the mediation. Karen had acted on her biases, unconscious as they may have been. And as much as it stung, Karen knew Veronica was right. She needed to learn. She needed to change. So, in the days that followed, Karen began to take responsibility for her actions. She enrolled in a series of diversity and social awareness courses to help her better understand the biases that had shaped her worldview. It wasn't easy. The courses were uncomfortable at times, challenging her assumptions, making her confront difficult truths about herself. But slowly, Karen started to understand. She realized that her perception of Jada, of so many things, had been clouded by years of conditioning and unconscious prejudices. She learned that when people are conditioned to see the world in a certain way, it becomes easy to make assumptions without understanding the full picture. And she had done exactly that. She had seen a young black girl standing near parked cars and, without a second thought, jumped to conclusions. Karen was uncomfortable, yes, but she kept pushing through the discomfort, understanding that it was the only way forward. She knew that her education had to be ongoing, that real change didn't happen overnight, but she was committed to the work, however difficult it might be. She wanted to become a better person, not just for herself, but for the community she lived in. Karen knew that healing wouldn't happen just through words or apologies. It had to be backed by action, backed by genuine change. Meanwhile, Jada, though not charged with any crime, struggled with her own feelings in the wake of the incident. She hadn't expected this. All she had wanted was to have a peaceful day with Maya and enjoy an afternoon of ice cream. But instead, she found herself thrust into an unjust situation that made her question things she hadn't before, things about herself, her place in the world, and how others viewed her simply because of the color of her skin. At first, Jada couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. It wasn't just the fact that Karen had accused her. She knew that people sometimes had preconceived notions about others, especially in small towns like Westfield. But the fact that the police had been called, that the whole situation had escalated so quickly, made Jada feel exposed. She wasn't a criminal, but for a moment she had felt like one. She had felt like she didn't belong, like her presence there had somehow been wrong. The sting of that accusation had cut deeper than she had expected. But Jada wasn't alone in this. Her mom, Detective Veronica, had been a constant support throughout the whole ordeal, offering comfort and guidance when Jada needed it most. Veronica had been there during the mediation, standing up for Jada with a strength that only a mother could have. And outside of that, she continued to encourage Jada to focus on her dreams and not let one person's ignorance define her. Aunt Gloria, too, was a source of strength for Jada. After the mediation, Aunt Gloria had stayed close, helping Jada process her feelings and reassuring her that everything would be okay. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," Gloria would say, brushing Jada's hair back from her forehead, always careful with her words. "People sometimes act out of fear, but that doesn't mean you have to carry their fear with you. You're strong and you have a bright future ahead." Still, the weight of it all was hard to shake. Jada would often find herself lost in thought, replaying the events of that afternoon. She would think about Karen's accusations, the police arriving, and how the world had seemed to stop while she stood there, waiting for someone to believe her. It wasn't just about the incident itself. It was the realization that this kind of thing could happen again. And while she knew that not everyone thought like Karen, it was hard not to wonder if other people would judge her the same way. But over time, with the support of her mom and Aunt Gloria, Jada began to heal. She slowly started to let go of the anger and hurt that had weighed so heavily on her. It wasn't easy, but she found strength in forgiveness. She knew that holding on to the bitterness wouldn't help her move forward. "You don't have to forget," Aunt Gloria had told her one evening as they sat together on the porch, "but forgiveness isn't just for the other person, it's for you too." It was a lesson that Jada carried with her. She didn't need to carry the weight of Karen's actions any longer. She could forgive, not for Karen's sake, but for her own peace of mind. It didn't mean that what had happened was okay. It wasn't. But forgiveness allowed her to free herself from the negative emotions that had threatened to consume her. With each passing day, Jada began to feel a sense of resilience growing inside her. She wasn't the same girl who had stood outside the ice cream shop that afternoon. The experience had changed her, but not in the way that Karen had hoped. Instead of breaking her, it had made her stronger. She had learned that standing up for herself was important, that her voice mattered, and that she deserved to be heard. Jada started to focus on her dreams again, her passion for mysteries, her desire to one day work for the FBI just like her mom. She poured herself into her books, read more about famous detectives, and practiced solving small puzzles in her spare time. Jada knew that she still had a long way to go, but she was determined to keep moving forward, no matter what. As for Karen, her journey was only beginning. The courses she attended, the lessons she learned were steps in the right direction, but Karen knew she couldn't undo what had been done. However, she could be a better person going forward. And in time, she hoped the community would see that she had truly changed, just as she had promised to herself. Through it all, Jada had learned an invaluable lesson that while people can be wrong and make mistakes, it's how they grow from those mistakes that defines them. And Jada, with the support of her family, had found a way to turn her own painful experience into something that would propel her toward a brighter future. In the weeks that followed the mediation, the small town of Westfield began to feel like a different place. The event that had shaken the foundation of the community was far from forgotten, but it had sparked something deeper within its people. Something that would, in time, lead to change, not just for Jada but for the whole town. For Karen Thompson, the experience was a wake-up call. The guilt that had been weighing on her since the day she'd called the police on Jada became impossible to ignore. At first, she had tried to convince herself that she had been acting out of concern for the neighborhood. But as the days passed and the mediation made her face the full extent of her actions, Karen realized something else. She had allowed her unconscious biases to cloud her judgment. She had acted out of fear, not facts, and in doing so, she had hurt an innocent child. Karen knew she couldn't take back the harm she'd caused, but she could try to make things right. She enrolled in several community programs focused on diversity, inclusion, and bias awareness. She sat in uncomfortable, yet necessary, classes that forced her to confront the prejudices she had never questioned before. For weeks, she attended seminars on racial bias and systemic inequality, listening to experts and hearing from people who had experienced the very things she had once dismissed. She was uncomfortable, terribly so. At first, Karen felt defensive, wanting to argue back, but she soon realized that the discomfort was part of the process. It was a sign of growth. It wasn't easy to change, but Karen was determined to do the work. Slowly, she began to understand the depth of her own biases and how those biases had impacted her actions. It wasn't just about seeing Jada in a moment of suspicion. It was about the assumptions she made based on a lifetime of stereotypes. Karen also started volunteering at community events, attending town meetings, and engaging in conversations she had once avoided. She reached out to local groups working on social justice and education, trying to make amends by contributing her time and energy to causes that mattered. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness or instant trust from the community. She knew that would take time. But what mattered most was that Karen was committed to doing better. As Karen worked on herself, she began to notice something remarkable. Her relationships with her neighbors were shifting. People in Westfield were watching, and slowly, they started to notice that she wasn't the same person who had been so quick to judge. At the local grocery store, people began to smile at her again. When she ran into neighbors at Manny's Brew, they greeted her with kindness, as if they saw that she was trying, that she was making an effort. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone forgave her right away, but there was a change. The walls that had once existed between Karen and the community started to crumble, brick by brick. Meanwhile, Jada had her own journey to navigate. Though she had faced the injustice of that day, she wasn't going to let it define her. With the support of her mom, Detective Veronica Williams, and Aunt Gloria, Jada began to heal. She felt safe and loved, and those feelings became the foundation on which she built her strength. Her mom had always been a role model, strong, dedicated, and unwavering in the face of adversity. Jada took that to heart and began to shift her focus back to the things she loved, her studies, her love of reading, and, of course, her dreams of becoming a detective. But it wasn't just about looking inward for Jada. It was about giving back. With her mom's encouragement, Jada started volunteering at local youth programs, using her experiences to help other kids who might have been facing challenges of their own. She worked with kids from different backgrounds, talking to them about self-empowerment and justice, encouraging them to stand up for themselves and never back down in the face of adversity. Jada's involvement in these causes gave her a sense of purpose. She didn't want to just let the incident fade away as a memory. She wanted to make sure that the lessons learned weren't forgotten. The situation had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it also strengthened her resolve to fight for fairness and equality. She became passionate about teaching others how to confront bias, share their voices, and demand the respect they deserved. As the weeks turned into months, Westfield itself began to feel the ripple effects of the incident. The town, which had been shaken by what had happened to Jada, realized that it wasn't enough to just acknowledge the problem in one isolated event. The entire community needed to do better, to create an environment where everyone felt safe, respected, and valued. Local schools began offering programs on diversity and inclusion, focusing on educating young people about the dangers of stereotyping and bias. The police department started offering training on racial profiling and how to handle situations with more understanding and sensitivity. They didn't want another incident like what had happened with Jada to ever occur again. The local paper, the Westfield Gazette, ran an editorial about the incident, highlighting the need for change and the importance of community healing. The piece didn't just focus on Jada's pain. It also acknowledged Karen's journey and the work she was doing to atone for her actions. The community, as a whole, was beginning to recognize that growth and healing weren't just about moving on from the past, but about actively learning and improving for the future. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. Jada's experience was not in vain. It had opened eyes, created conversations, and sparked the beginning of real change. And as Jada stood next to her mom at a local town hall meeting one evening, speaking to a room full of parents, teachers, and community leaders about the importance of standing up for what's right, she realized that this was the future she had always dreamed of. A future where people listened, where change was possible, and where everyone was given a chance to be heard. "Don't let anyone tell you who you are," Jada said to the crowd, her voice steady but strong. "You are worthy of respect, no matter what anyone else might say. Stand tall and never back down." As she finished speaking, a soft wave of applause rippled through the room. Jada looked up at her mom, who was smiling with pride, and at Aunt Gloria, who had been there every step of the way. Jada felt a sense of peace settle over her, peace knowing that, despite everything she had gone through, she had turned that moment of injustice into something powerful. A lesson learned, a change made, and a community that had come together stronger than before. Westfield was no longer the town it had been before that fateful afternoon. It had evolved. It had grown. And as Jada left the meeting that night, walking hand in hand with her mom and Aunt Gloria, she knew that, just like her, the town would keep moving forward, one step at a time, towards a brighter, more inclusive future.